Science is not the first tool that policymakers think about when they're writing legislation. They want to know what's the communication strategy, who are our members, who are our donors, how does this affect the local economies of these communities. I was a soccer player before I was a scientist. As I think about interdisciplinary approach, it's not only the science aspect, but it's the ability to communicate science and find different sciences and how they operate together.
Welcome to the Science with Impact podcast. Here we discuss strategies, stories, and experiences to broaden the societal impacts of STEM. And we have Dr. Zack Valdez here. I'm so honored to have you as a guest. Zack, would you be willing to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Vanessa. Zack Valdez. I am a academic industry nonprofit expert, really focused in on how do we not only build the future we want to see, but bring people along with us to help do it. So I've worked across academia. I've been in the Senate, national nonprofits, and then multiple federal agencies, including a stint with the former administration as the chief of staff for the Department of Energy, currently working to support electrical manufacture.
Why should our listeners, who are primarily research scientists and organizations seeking to expand their societal impact, tune into our conversation?
Because we need to be open to the fact that we only know so much and that our characters and our personalities are just as important to our science as they are to our impact.
How did you get to know me and Science with Impact?
Me and Vanessa had the opportunity to spend some time at a leadership conference under SOCNUS, where we spent a week together up in Maryland, identifying ways to figure out our leadership style as well as lead others towards STEM and understand why that's important. And so it was a really good opportunity to meet a bunch of people who were also interested in what we were doing. I think it's really focused in on giving us case studies and opportunities to understand what leadership at SOCNUS means, what leadership in STEM means, and expand our network as well.
Can you tell us a story about an impactful moment in your life that led to you becoming a scientist?
I think there's so many different impactful moments, but I was always just curious about the world around me like anyone else. And growing up, high school science became interesting to me because I was good at it. I was also really good at soccer, so you could say the same thing about that. But having the opportunity to learn about the world around me and what it meant and understand the forces around it during high school and having those labs was always really interesting to me. Becoming a scientist, I don't even know what that means. That's such an interesting question, right? What is a scientist is probably the better question because I can tell you, like, even as a PhD, I did science. I guess you could call me a scientist, but I think it would start from an early age of just being curious about the world around me. And that impactful moment was just weaved into maybe being a little bit closer to nature and seeing how the forces of gravity and photosynthesis all kind of came together and what I saw.
I love that. I think curiosity is it just seems like such a cardinal part of what it means to be human. And I love how many stories I've heard from scientists that connect this career that has brought them so much fulfillment and challenge originating in curiosity. Can you tell us like a childhood story of you being curious about something that maybe looking back on now was clearly indicative of where you ended up?
My mom was really big into gardening. She would go out and spend hours toiling in the garden. And at a young age, you take for granted sort of plants growing. But I think as I got older, probably in like second or third grade, not only helping my mom in the garden to go from to fruit when we had tomatoes in our backyard or lorries along the fence, but really getting to watch the progression of an organism and understand what it meant to have enough water and why you had to plant it in certain places to get certain sunlight. That was such a cool experience for me looking back and seeing that at an early age we take things for granted and that there is a process and there's a science behind it. And I don't think my mom ever talked me through the science, but that definitely inspired me to be like, I like to learn how things operate and the process that they get involved in doing that.
What's so beautiful about your mom and gardening and morning glories? And it paints such a beautiful picture. This is where we remind our listeners of our mission and encourage them to join forces. This is our newsletter. Here we highlight our past guests, resources and frameworks that we've developed, and other tools and strategies and stories behind broadening your scientific impact on society. So we strongly encourage you to subscribe. You've had an impressive career trajectory moving from academia into government, industry, and the nonprofits. What inspired you to take this interdisciplinary approach, and how have you been able to leverage your diverse experiences to drive change?
Growing up, I was a soccer player before I was a scientist. When I was 4 years old, I can remember like running after a ball on a field and shooting at a goal. And I think a lot of that sort of stayed with me no matter how old. I still play soccer. As I think about interdisciplinary approach, it's not only the science aspect, but it's the ability to communicate science and find different sciences and how they operate together. So just being open to how people talk about what they're interested in and being in engineering initially and thinking about the world from a very technical focus and then moving into physics as a second major, it got me really involved in like the numbers part of it and how we calculate things. But I was always interested in more. And I think soccer allowed me to learn and integrate with groups outside of the science community. And I had a really unique opportunity to work at a research lab at the Stanford Linear Accelerator that kind of showcased like different types of energy. It was at the precipice of physics. But I was like, also, this whole like renewable energy thing is cool, and I want to get involved in more of the earth sciences aspect. I went to get a PhD, and it was in biogeochemistry, which are things that I didn't have a lot of experience in. My ability to adapt and talk about science and learn from other people through sports really helped me leverage all those experiences to think about how can I communicate science? How can I take this engineering and physics principles into earth science and really help create new ways of thinking about the world around me? And in that case, it was biofuel development.
Can you walk me through more of how those two interact in your mind?
I think soccer is a way to learn how to communicate effectively that a lot of scientists don't get instruction in. We are taught to talk about science to other scientists, and I'm always excited to talk about science. I love science, right? So when I was on these long haul bus trips to New Mexico from San Antonio, I wanted to talk about science or think about things in a scientific way. And as I moved into sort of renewable energy, I would say so much of what I was talking about was just trying to relate why it was important to the people around me who didn't think about it on an everyday basis, and where there may be solutions in science that people that aren't engaging with science as often can think about it a little bit differently and finding ways that help them appreciate it a little bit more and ask more questions.
One thing that you probably have that is unique, almost anybody I've had the opportunity to talk to, is that you could probably take a sentence or a phrase and reshape it for the different sectors that you've advanced. Like if you had to talk about biofuel to another scientist, what would that sentence look like versus talking to the general public versus nonprofit versus government policy? Can you be able to walk us through the differences in how you communicate things in those different areas of your life?
For me, communicating biofuels or my PhD thesis to another science is, and I think even in science, as an interdisciplinary science, am I talking to a chemist? Am I talking to a biologist? Am I talking to a geoscientist who really cares about soil? And so, whenever you're communicating anything, you have to understand your audience and ask them, like, what do you know about biofuels? And they'll be like, oh, I don't know, is that corn and ethanol? And I'm like, yeah, there's other types too. We can use biodiesel or switchgrass is a weed that grows anywhere. And do you know that it goes into your fuel tank? And finding that part of it is really important for a scientist because do you want to talk about the molecular structure of carbons or the soil impacts or water impacts for more earth scientists? But as I change over to policy, it's more strategy. Do you have biofuel production in your district? As I talk to maybe just the general public, it's you've seen that 10% ethanol on the gas. Do you know what that does? Do you know where that comes from? Do you know what impact that has on the environment? And so I try to relate it back to why they would care. And then if I do it well, I find that they ask me more questions. If I don't do it well, they're like, okay, that's cool. So I want to make sure that it's interesting to them, just like any other teacher probably did for us.
getting to know your audience doesn't have to be something that you do ahead of time. You can do it on the spot by asking questions, and you'll know you've succeeded if they ask you questions in return. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, absolutely.
What is the difference in the gas pumps and how does that work?
Without getting too nerdy, ethanol was created due to a gas crisis in the 70s and 80s. And so we were like, we can create an alternative fuel we can drop in to reduce our reliance on foreign oil. So we started introducing it into the gas tanks of our cars and vehicles. It's not necessarily the best thing for our vehicles. It chokes off the miles per gallon. And I'll be honest with you, it's not the best thing for our environment because traditional corn ethanol uses a lot of fertilizers, it takes a lot of water, it doesn't put it back into the soil. You're pulling out a lot of nutrients and you're not putting them back in. Not positive impact on carbon or nutrient resources, soil ecosystems. Another way that we thought to do this was using switchgrass, which is just like a really big weed. It doesn't provide as much of the cellulosic ethanol or ethanol, but it actually improves overall natural ecosystems. So in a way, it gets back to that theme I brought up at the beginning, which is putting in more than you're taking out and really having that opportunity to do that with my science was even better.
We drive very old cars intentionally. I think my car is a 2004. And for that car, my husband asked that we put the 91 fuel in it because he said it makes it run better. Can you teach me what that's about?
The higher octane allows a higher temperature to pass through the engine. And so it's creating more combustion capabilities. You could think about it as like an energy bar. And so having 86 versus 91% of your energy in there is like how much energy you're going to get out of that reaction in your vehicle. And so for newer vehicles, they just run much more smoothly. They are generally lighter. And so for the older vehicles, one, it keeps it cleaner, so your engine stays cleaner longer. But the other part is it provides more like horsepower and availability to your engine to pump cleaner. I would say it's burning hotter, faster, keeping your engine cleaner. And so everybody can use it. I think the newer vehicles have created engines that don't need that much octane. If you can afford it, everybody should be using 91 octane, but obviously it's a premium.
If you were to have a pump that was ethanol, what would the energy bar on that one be?
So if you had like ethanol next to gasoline, ethanol generally doesn't give you as much energy, a gallon of ethanol versus a gallon of gasoline. And so you wouldn't get as far in your car. That's why we only mix in 10%. Also, it does this thing called coking, which basically creates like a residue that our vehicles aren't necessarily prepared to deal with. And another good reason for your older cars not to use the lower octane fuel is because that coking will build up and ultimately could create a failure. That's why it's just an additive. It's a way to reduce the amount of gasoline that goes in your car. It's an antiquated addition to our fuel system, if you ask me personally. I'm sure there's people that could disagree, but the reason behind why we did it was to be less reliant on foreign oil. And now I think we're one of the largest producers of oil and gas. And I can say that I worked in the oil and gas industry too. I should say that from Texas. There's a whole background there too.
If you could wave a wand and fix as many of the issues with fuel and where we get it from and how it affects the world overnight, what would you do?
Fuel is a function of energy, right? And I just wish people had a limitless amount of energy they needed to do the things they want to do, and it wasn't an inhibitory function of our society. The first thing that came to mind was potentially countries that don't have a fuel integrated system. Maybe it's the central Saharan desert or up in the mountains of the Himalayan, and those communities have to ship in fuel resources or they're still burning wood to cook their food. I think my magic wand would be ways to find whether it's solar or nuclear or whatever it is. I think when we can distribute energy or fuel directly to people, and that's why solar's so cool. It doesn't matter where you are, the sun hopefully is shining. If it's not, then maybe the wind's blowing and we can use a wind farm, right? But if you can capture that energy and then turning it into maybe not fuel, but electricity, then you can study at night. You can worry less about how you're going to cook your food or when you're going to cook your food. And as much as I am a proponent of renewable energy or clean energy or advanced energy, I'm also a proponent of meeting people where they are. And so, working in the Biden administration, we're pushing clean energy and we want more wind, we want more solar, we want more batteries. But I also grew up in Texas, and I realized that there's parts of this country that can't adopt that type of energy as quickly. And so we shouldn't force that on them, but we should say, let's let you be aware of the impacts that you could be having to your public health, to your environmental health, and find ways to just diversify that portfolio for you so that you have a choice.
Science policy has such a tremendous impact on everyone. And what I love about science policy is that it seems very focused on long term economic stability and at times global sustainability. And so it just seems like when you're focused on writing policy about what people can and cannot do, I really feel like people in your position are considering the weight of those decisions very heavily. I don't know, am I getting the right opinion or perspective of that?
I find that a lot of scientists coming into policy are a little bit more open-minded about the roles of science in policy. And so they will think about it from multiple angles, both long and short term and different cases. But it's not easy to be a good chemist and a good biologist and a good health science approach person, right? But the good thing about science is, and hopefully getting your PhD or your advanced degree is, you can critically think about and you know how to get quality information to make a strong argument. The part that we don't, at least in the physical sciences, do a good job of is thinking about what impacts that has to society or the economic impacts that those have, like you mentioned. We can look into it, but a lot of times you're not going to have your biology PhD and an economics PhD and a public health PhD. And then how do we make sure that in this environment that people are aware of what that involves? But I think that there's a lot of really smart people in policy that think about it from just how does this impact the people in my district or in my state or in my country? And being a global citizen is so important, but also being a scientist and saying this is where my perspective is coming from and being able to defend that is really important. And I think as scientists, we need to find better ways to communicate why things are important and what facts mean. One of the stories that I always tell is I came to DC after I finished my PhD and I worked in Congress. And I was like, I'm going to be a smart person that's going to shape policy with science. And I was so humbled because science is not the first tool that policymakers think about when they're writing legislation. They want to know what's the communication strategy, who are our members, who are our donors, like how does this affect the local economies of these communities? Often in science, I was working on a bill to reject oil and gas drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And so I built this really long report. I had footnotes, I had all the science stuff that we were taught to do as good scientists. Here's my data, here's where I got it from, here's why it's good. And my boss was like, okay, well, I want you to break that down to a page. Give me a one pager on that. I'm like, okay, you want me to go from 30 to one page? That's tough. And so I gave him that, and he's like, all right, now I just want a half a page and I want a chart. Like, give me some sort of figure. And I was like, okay. And so we got back to that. Then he's okay, well, if the senator's going to use this, it needs to be one line and a visual. And we got in this real roundtable with all of these like national nonprofits and wildlife refuge X groups. And they were like, you know what? I think we're just going to use a picture of these caribou that migrate through this area. And the whole time I'm thinking, I did all this research to show you why economically it's not feasible, like environmentally, how it's going to impact people, all of the science that you needed. And they were like, yeah, but this is going to resonate with the general public more than really caring about those things. Those are not things that impact them directly. And so I think it gets back to like when we think of climate science and you think of like global warming, one of the first things that may come to mind is like the polar bear on the little piece of ice, right? And finding ways to communicate our science is still something I think that is so important to our industry and our livelihood.
So often we write research articles. That's the primary mechanism through which we disseminate our work and acquire funding and turns the wheels of academia is to publish our work. But oftentimes we're writing to each other, which is interesting. Rarely do we take the time to then take that whole paper that you wrote, condense it to one line in a picture that resonates. And For all the scientists who are listening, I almost encourage you to just try. Pick your favorite paper that you've written and just try. And then maybe you can guide and encourage your graduate students to get in the practice of doing that. Because if you can resonate with people, you can make an impact. That could be through policy or getting funding or a startup or any number of things. But that's just such a great takeaway. I want to make sure to underscore it.
I actually got into policy somewhat by accident. I was at a national conference. It was an elevator pitch, and they had 6 cards that you would draw randomly. It was like public, a young teen, one of your grandparents, a policy environment, or a scientist. And you randomly picked one of these, and then you had to, on the spot, give your pitch about your thesis or your most recent paper. And I won. I didn't train. I was just like, I'm going to go do this. This is fun. I love talking about science and I love doing these things. And there was like a person next to me that had notes and they had done all of the things that they were supposed to do. And I think they were too structured in how they were trying to think about it. They had a pitch for each one, they were ready to go. And afterwards, I talked to the organization. They said, when you walked in the room, you talked to everybody in the room. When you got up there, you owned what you were saying and you were excited about it. You weren't rehearsed to say this was something that you cared about. And that shines. And so he was like, I would love for you to come up to DC and talk to policymakers about this kind of stuff because they need your kind of energy, they need your kind of knowledge. So I went up and did some hill visits, and then they said, you need to apply for this science policy fellowship that we have because we think it'd be a great opportunity for you to see if this is something you enjoy. So maybe we failed to get through like how I made it to DC, but it was being passionate about what I cared about and being even more passionate that other people got to at least be aware of what I was doing in the science community.
I'm really glad that your passions have led you to this career, and I'm excited to see how that continues to drive you. As a Latino scientist, you've navigated unique challenges in your career. Can you share any insights or advice for underrepresented scientists in STEM fields who may be looking to expand their impact beyond traditional academia?
Join organizations. Your network is so important. I think as scientists, we understand like if you go to Harvard, then you're connected to the leading researcher in X, Y, and Z and the doors that opens for you. If you are not fortunate, I think like most people to go to an Ivy League school, you have to create that network. And that is so important. So I would say creating that network and finding organizations like SACNAS or SHIP or Great Minds in STEM or NESB or ACES and leverage those to build your network, to build other people. They don't have to be in your science, but they do need to be people who you see your future and envision like who you'd want to go to a hiking adventure with or something. And it helps to have people who have a similar background because then you can share challenges that you've overcome, I hope, or opportunities that you're looking for guidance in. And so for me, I did that. And I also reached out and found people with a similar background in some sense that maybe weren't in science and saying, like, where is what I'm communicating not landing because of my background or because I'm a scientist? And so a lot of times these were like business people or business owners that were like, you're being way too technical or you're using words that I don't understand. I think the underlying thing that always drove me to want to be successful as an underrepresented science was one, growing up and not seeing a science teacher that I guess looked like me. I can't make judgments on what their background was. But then I went to an HSI and I saw a bunch of professors that looked like they had similar backgrounds. And so I got to my PhD and I was like, wait, I went to another school that didn't have anybody that looked like not only in my classes, but none of my teachers really with my background. And so I went through this like roller coaster of do I belong or don't I belong? But the whole time I realized that one of the things that was most important to me was sharing my story and inspiring the next generation of scientists with a similar background. And so to this day, I do science fairs. I coach my neighborhood soccer kids, right? And I tell them about how I'm a scientist, and a lot of them appear to be maybe underrepresented groups in the science fields. And so my focus has always been on the next generation and trying to be the person that I needed to be where I am today. In science policy, we have affinity groups in DC that support science policy folks that maybe don't have a voice. And so I would say that's one part of it because there is a large how can people in this space gain funding and opportunities. I recently had a friend, a colleague, who's running for a congressional seat, and he put it to me this way. This whole network is your net worth thing is huge because he's having to like go to donors and ask for money. And he's, who do you know, Zach? And I'm like, I don't know anybody who has millions of dollars who's willing to fund a campaign. And I think that's because even though I live in DC and I consider myself relatively well connected, money has never been something that I've tried to get into the circles of those people. But I should still try because I think part of that is one of the blind spots that I'm just now realizing. If you want opportunity, I can connect you to plenty of people in the science policy space. But if you're looking for funding, just like external funding, that's a little bit tougher. I think you could leverage the more common traditional routes of NSF, and I can help support your DOE efforts if you're applying for a grant, small business loans. But I think understanding what the philanthropy landscape is, finding some of those people that you can have a coffee with is so important, as I've found to build your portfolio or your profile as a scientist who's underrepresented. And don't rest on your laurels of science. Science should only be a portion of who you are. What's your personality? Like, I enjoy playing soccer. I enjoy traveling. I enjoy spending time with my friends. I like to play golf. I like to cook with my wife. I'm going to a beer festival this weekend. Find other people that have interest outside your science community that can then broaden or connect you to others. And I think that's another good way to build those connections and maybe not leave it to fate or a formal application through NSF or another federal agency or philanthropy. I would say, David, I love the fact that you are including the A in STEM and incorporating art. What are the opportunities to integrate STEM across different fields? And what was the inspirational moment where you felt like you were actually creating impact?
Our past guest was Dr. Carmen Banks. She's a cell and molecular biologist. She started Melanin in Science as a company, and they're focused on higher education and professional development for graduate students who are broadening their horizons. Her question of you is this.
In a funding landscape where it is extremely hard for folks of color and women to fundraise, what can folks do to help diversify the landscape, and what advice would he give to folks of color or folks who historically have not had as much opportunity to get the same amount of funds?
I would say there are organizations that support minorities in the manufacturing sector, which is abroad. I would say in science policy, we have affinity groups in DC that support science policy folks that maybe don't have a voice. And so I would say that's one part of it because there is a large cohort of us that feel like one, we're underrepresented in science, and then maybe two, we're even more underrepresented in science policy.